The moment my wife smiled and said our marriage was over, I realized she had no idea I had already finished the hardest part. Olivia set her silver suitcase beside the front door and looked around the living room as though she had rehearsed this moment 100 times during her trip. The late afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, filling the house with the same warm glow that had welcomed us home for nearly 12 years. Nothing looked different. The framed family photographs were still arranged above the fireplace. The blue ceramic bowl we bought during our vacation to Charleston still rested on the coffee table. Even the faint smell of fresh coffee lingered in the air because I had brewed a pot less than 15 minutes before she arrived. She smiled politely, almost confidently, before taking a slow breath. "Ethan," she said, "when I got back, I wanted us to have an honest conversation." I nodded once and quietly motioned toward the dining room. "I have been waiting for that conversation," I replied. She followed me without hesitation, completely unaware that I had spent the last 6 weeks preparing for this exact afternoon. She believed this was the beginning of our story. For me, it was already the final chapter of something that had started falling apart months earlier. Olivia placed her purse on the dining table and remained standing. I noticed she was still wearing the same beige travel coat she had left in 3 days before. Her suitcase carried a fresh airline baggage tag from Denver, the city where she insisted an executive leadership conference had taken place. I had stopped believing that explanation long before she boarded the plane. She folded her hands together and looked directly into my eyes. There was sadness on her face, but there was also certainty. "I think we both know this marriage cannot continue," she said quietly. The room became perfectly still. I reached into the leather portfolio resting beside my chair and gently slid a neatly organized folder across the polished oak table until it stopped in front of her. She frowned slightly without opening it. "What is this?" she asked. I leaned back in my chair, keeping my voice calm and steady. "Everything you were planning to say," I answered, "along with everything I discovered before you even packed your suitcase." The confidence disappeared from her face almost instantly. She looked from the folder back to me, searching for the confusion she expected to see, but it was not there. I had already lived through the confusion alone. What remained now was clarity. Looking back, I often tell people that betrayal rarely begins with one unforgettable lie. It begins with dozens of tiny moments that seem too insignificant to question until one ordinary afternoon, you realize the person standing across from you has been quietly living a completely different life. And that realization started for me almost 6 months before Olivia ever booked that trip. Olivia stared at the folder without touching it. The confidence that had carried her through the front door only moments earlier slowly faded into uncertainty. I watched her eyes search my face, trying to determine whether this was some kind of misunderstanding or a conversation she had somehow lost control of before it even began. Finally, she slid the folder closer and opened it. Inside were neatly organized copies of flight confirmations, hotel reservations, financial statements, phone records that I had legally obtained through our shared accounts, and notes documenting the timeline that had quietly unfolded over the previous 6 months. She did not flip through every page. She did not have to. The first few documents were enough. Her shoulders dropped, and she slowly closed the folder again. "How long have you known?" she asked in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. I folded my hands together on the table before answering. Long enough to stop guessing and start verifying. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument either of us could have had. Looking back, I realized people often imagine betrayal as one dramatic moment, but that was never my experience. It arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary changes that seemed too small to matter. 6 months earlier, Olivia had begun working later than usual several nights each week. She explained that her company was preparing for a major expansion, and I believed her because I had never been given a reason not to. Then weekend business trips appeared on her calendar more frequently. She smiled less during dinner. Her phone remained face down on the kitchen counter instead of charging beside our bed like it always had. None of those things proved anything on their own. Life becomes busy. Careers become demanding. Married couples adjust. That was exactly what I kept telling myself. Even when conversations became shorter and laughter became less common, I convinced myself we were simply going through another stressful season. The first moment that truly unsettled me happened on an ordinary Tuesday evening. Olivia was preparing dinner while her phone vibrated repeatedly on the kitchen island. She stepped outside to answer a work call, leaving the screen illuminated for only a few seconds. I was not trying to read her messages, but one notification appeared clearly enough that I could not ignore it. The sender's first name was Ryan. The message read, "Only 3 more weeks. Nothing more. Nothing less." When Olivia returned inside, she immediately picked up her phone and dismissed the notification before I could ask about it. Later that night, she casually explained that Ryan was part of a leadership project from another regional office. Her explanation sounded reasonable, and once again I accepted it. Looking back now, I understand that trust often encourages us to explain away the very details we should examine more carefully. Over the following weeks, similar moments quietly accumulated. A conference schedule that changed twice without explanation. A hotel confirmation sent to our shared email account before quickly disappearing. Receipts from restaurants in cities different from the ones listed on her travel itinerary. Individually, each detail seemed almost meaningless. Together, they formed a pattern I could no longer ignore. That was the moment I made a promise to myself. I would not accuse the woman I had loved for more than a decade based on suspicion alone. If our marriage truly stood at the edge of a cliff, I wanted every decision I made afterward to rest on facts instead of assumptions. So while Olivia believed I was simply going about my ordinary routine, I quietly began assembling the truth one careful piece at a time, never imagining where that path would ultimately lead both of us. Olivia remained seated across from me, her hands resting quietly on the closed folder, as though opening it again might somehow change what was inside. The evening sunlight that had filled our dining room only minutes earlier gradually faded into the softer glow of the kitchen lights, and the familiar comfort of our home suddenly felt strangely unfamiliar. Neither of us rushed to speak. After 12 years of marriage, silence had become just as meaningful as words. Finally, Olivia looked at me with tired eyes. "You investigated me," she said softly. There was disappointment in her voice, but not outrage. I nodded once. "No," I replied. "I investigated the questions that kept growing every time I trusted another explanation." She lowered her head without arguing. Looking back now, I understand that there is an important difference between suspicion and confirmation. Suspicion creates fear. Confirmation creates decisions. I never wanted to become the husband who searched for reasons to doubt his wife. I simply reached the point where ignoring obvious inconsistencies would have been dishonest to myself. 6 months earlier, our life had still appeared almost ordinary. We woke up together every morning, shared coffee before work, and spent most Sunday afternoons visiting my parents or taking long walks through Balboa Park. Friends often described us as one of the strongest couples they knew. We laughed at those compliments because neither of us believed marriage was ever effortless. We believed it worked because both people continued choosing each other every day. Somewhere along the way, however, that daily choice quietly became something only one of us was still making. After noticing the first unusual messages, I stopped relying on assumptions and began paying attention to facts. I kept a small notebook inside my desk drawer at work. Every time something seemed inconsistent, I wrote down the date instead of confronting Olivia immediately. One week, she said she would spend Thursday evening meeting clients downtown, yet the credit card statement later showed dinner purchased nearly 40 miles away in a neighboring city. Another weekend, she mentioned staying at the convention hotel, but an airline confirmation accidentally delivered to our shared email account listed a completely different reservation. None of those details proved betrayal by themselves. They simply refused to fit together. The more carefully I observed, the more I realized the truth was not hiding behind one dramatic secret. It was scattered across dozens of ordinary moments that no longer matched the life we claimed to be living. Then came the business trip to Denver. Olivia spent nearly 2 weeks talking about conference presentations, networking events, and executive workshops. She even printed an event schedule and left it on the kitchen counter. At first glance, everything looked perfectly believable. A few days before her departure, however, I searched the conference website because I wanted to surprise her by sending flowers to the hotel during her keynote presentation. Instead, I discovered something I could not explain. The conference dates did not match the itinerary she had given me. According to the official schedule, the event had ended several days before her flight was supposed to leave. I checked again, convinced I had made a mistake. I had not. That single discovery changed everything. Rather than confronting her, I quietly continued gathering information until every unanswered question pointed toward the same conclusion. By the time Olivia packed her suitcase and kissed me goodbye before leaving for the airport, I already understood that the trip she believed would change our future was never the beginning of the story. It was simply the moment when every hidden piece would finally come together, and I intended to meet that moment prepared instead of surprised. Olivia listened without interrupting, her eyes fixed on the folder as though every page carried a version of herself she no longer recognized. She slowly ran her fingertips across the edge of the cover before asking the question I had expected from the beginning. Why did you never confront me? I leaned back in my chair and looked toward the family photographs hanging along the dining room wall. There we were celebrating birthdays, standing beside the Grand Canyon, laughing on a beach in Florida, smiling in front of our first home after signing the closing papers. None of those moments had been fake. They were simply memories from a time when trust had still been effortless. Because I wanted the truth, I answered quietly, not an argument built on guesses. She lowered her eyes again. Looking back now, I realized I had spent weeks preparing for a conversation I secretly hoped would never happen. After discovering the conference dates did not match her itinerary, I took 2 vacation days from work without telling anyone why. I contacted an attorney, not because I had already decided to end my marriage, but because I wanted to understand my responsibilities before emotions clouded my judgment. The attorney encouraged me to move carefully, document facts instead of assumptions, and avoid making decisions based solely on suspicion. That advice became my anchor. Over the following days, I organized every document connected to our shared finances, reviewed household accounts, confirmed property records, and copied important paperwork into a secure folder. Nothing I did was dramatic. It was simply the quiet preparation of someone who understood that life can change much faster than emotions can recover. Meanwhile, Olivia continued speaking about the upcoming trip as though everything remained perfectly normal. She described conference sessions she planned to attend, restaurants recommended by coworkers, and networking dinners that would probably keep her busy late into the evening. I listened carefully, responding with the same warmth I always had. If she noticed anything different about me, she never mentioned it. The morning of her departure arrived with clear skies and unusually cool air for early spring. I helped place her suitcase into the trunk of her car before she hugged me goodbye. I will be home Sunday afternoon, she said with a gentle smile. We should probably talk when I get back. At the time, I wondered whether she had already decided how that conversation would end. I smiled politely and wished her a safe flight because there was nothing left to gain by asking questions whose answers I already suspected. After she drove away, I returned inside the quiet house and sat alone at the kitchen table. For several minutes, I simply listened to the silence. Then I opened my laptop and confirmed one final detail. The hotel reservation associated with her airline itinerary had been made for 2 guests instead of 1. I closed the computer without saying a word. There was no satisfaction in being right, only sadness that the last missing piece had finally found its place. During the 3 days Olivia was away, I never called to demand explanations or accuse her of anything. She sent short messages every evening saying meetings had gone well and that she looked forward to coming home. I answered each one politely because I believed difficult conversations deserve to happen face to face. By the time she walked through our front door carrying her suitcase, I had already accepted that whatever future waited for us would begin with complete honesty. She believed she was returning home prepared to control the conversation. She had no way of knowing that while she was planning what she wanted to say, I had already finished preparing for everything she might choose not to say at all. Olivia sat perfectly still after I finished speaking. The quiet confidence she had carried into the house was gone, replaced by the unmistakable expression of someone realizing the story she had carefully rehearsed no longer belonged to her. She slowly opened the folder again and turned another page. There was the airline itinerary. There were copies of hotel reservations. There were dates, receipts, and notes that fit together with uncomfortable precision. Finally, she closed the folder and looked directly at me. You already knew, she whispered. Not everything, I answered honestly. Only enough to understand that I could not continue pretending nothing had changed. She took a deep breath before asking another question. Did you think I stopped loving you? I remained silent for several seconds because the answer was more complicated than either of us wanted. No, I finally replied. I thought you stopped trusting me with the truth. Those words settled over the room more heavily than anything else we had said that evening. Looking back now, I believe that was the first moment Olivia truly understood why I had remained calm instead of angry. This conversation was never about winning an argument. It was about discovering whether honesty still had a place inside our marriage. She folded her hands together and quietly admitted that several months earlier she had reconnected with Ryan through a professional networking event. At first, their conversations focused entirely on work. They discussed leadership, career opportunities, and projects involving both companies. Then the conversations became personal. They started sharing stories about college, family, disappointments, and dreams they believed had slowly disappeared beneath everyday responsibilities. It felt harmless, she said softly, until it was no longer harmless. I listened without interrupting. She explained that the trip had been planned after weeks of telling herself she simply wanted clarity about feelings she no longer understood. She insisted that she believed meeting Ryan would finally help her decide what she wanted for the future. Instead, she spent most of the trip realizing that reality looked nothing like the conversations she had imagined. I kept thinking about home, she admitted. Every hotel room felt unfamiliar. Every dinner felt forced. I realized I had been chasing an idea instead of a real future. I watched her carefully, searching not for excuses but for consistency. Her voice never shifted into self-defense. She never blamed me for her decisions. She accepted responsibility for every choice she described, and that honesty made the conversation more painful because it sounded genuine. Then why did you come home planning to end our marriage? I asked quietly. She lowered her eyes before answering. Because I believed I had already damaged it beyond repair. I thought leaving would hurt you less than asking you to forgive something I was not sure deserved forgiveness. Another long silence filled the dining room. Outside, the neighborhood had grown completely dark, and the soft glow from the porch light reflected across the front windows. Inside, the familiar ticking of the kitchen clock suddenly seemed louder than usual. I realized that during the past 6 months I had prepared for every legal document, every financial decision, and every practical consequence that might follow. The one thing I had never prepared for was hearing genuine remorse instead of denial. That unexpected truth forced me to confront a question far more difficult than discovering hidden evidence. It was no longer about whether our marriage had been damaged. It was about whether two people who had finally stopped hiding from the truth still possessed enough courage to decide what should come next. Neither of us moved for several long moments after Olivia finished speaking. The silence inside the dining room no longer felt hostile. It felt honest. For the first time in months, there were no carefully chosen explanations, no convenient excuses, and no conversations hidden behind business trips or late meetings. There were only two people sitting across from one another, finally facing the truth neither of us could avoid any longer. I looked toward the folder resting between us before gently closing it. The documents answered my questions, I said quietly. They did not answer what happens next. Olivia nodded slowly. I understand. Her voice carried none of the confidence she had walked into the house with only an hour earlier. Looking back now, I realized I had spent weeks believing this evening would end with legal paperwork spread across the dining table and two people quietly preparing separate futures. Instead, I found myself confronting something far more complicated than anger. Genuine regret has a way of forcing you to reconsider decisions that once seemed obvious. That did not erase what had happened. It simply reminded me that life is rarely as simple as the stories we tell ourselves while preparing for difficult conversations. Olivia finally spoke again. I ended everything with Ryan before I came home, she said softly. I listened without interrupting. The second day of the trip, I realized I was trying to solve problems inside my marriage by escaping from them instead of facing them. We had dinner together once. We talked for hours. Then I understood that the version of my future I had imagined only existed inside my own expectations. It was never real. She paused before continuing. The last morning before my flight home, I told him we should never contact each other again. I studied her expression carefully. She never asked me to believe her. She simply stated the facts as she remembered them. That difference mattered. Why did you still come home planning to end our marriage? I asked. She slowly removed her wedding ring, held it gently in her palm for a few seconds, then placed it on the table between us without pushing it toward me. Because I believed you deserved the chance to build a better life with someone who had never betrayed your trust, she answered. I thought leaving was the only honest thing I had left to offer. I looked at the ring resting on the polished wood. For more than a decade, it had represented promises we both believed would last forever. Now it represented something much more fragile. The choice to continue could no longer depend on memories alone. It would require actions neither of us had ever been forced to take before. Later that evening, I told Olivia about my meeting with the attorney, the financial documents I had organized, and the practical plans I had quietly prepared in case our marriage ended. She listened without objection. You were protecting yourself, she said. You had every right to. There was no bitterness in her voice, only acceptance. That surprised me more than anything else. We talked until nearly midnight about subjects we had avoided for years. Work schedules that slowly replaced shared evenings. Small disappointments we dismissed instead of discussing. The dangerous habit of assuming the other person already understood what remained unspoken. None of those conversations excused the choices that had brought us here, but they revealed how easily distance can grow when honesty is postponed one ordinary day at a time. As I finally turned off the dining room lights and prepared to go upstairs, I realized I was no longer afraid of making the wrong decision. The truth had removed that fear. What remained was a different challenge entirely. Whether two people who had finally learned to speak honestly still possessed enough patience to rebuild something neither of them could ever take for granted again. The following morning, the house felt unusually quiet. For years, Olivia had been the first one awake, filling the kitchen with the smell of fresh coffee before either of us spoke a single word. That morning, I walked downstairs expecting the familiar routine, only to find her already sitting at the dining table with two untouched mugs resting between us. She looked exhausted, as though the weight of finally telling the truth had been heavier than either of us anticipated. She offered a faint smile as I took my seat across from her. I did not sleep very much, she admitted. Neither did I replied. Looking back now, I realized that honesty often arrives before peace. Telling the truth may end the uncertainty, but it does not immediately erase the consequences. We spent breakfast discussing practical matters instead of emotions. Work schedules, household bills, the projects waiting for both of us that week. It sounded almost ordinary, yet every sentence carried a different level of transparency than we had shared in months. Before leaving for the office, Olivia unlocked her phone, placed it on the table, and slid it toward me. You should not have to wonder anymore, she said quietly. I looked at the phone but never reached for it. I do not want to build trust by becoming your investigator, I answered. If we ever move forward, it has to be because we choose honesty, not because I monitor your life. She slowly nodded and placed the phone back into her purse without saying another word. Later that afternoon, I kept the appointment I had already scheduled with the attorney several weeks earlier. Sitting inside the conference room, I explained everything that had happened since our previous meeting. She listened carefully before closing the file she had prepared. Have you reached a decision? She asked. I looked through the office window toward the downtown skyline before answering. I have reached an understanding, I said. The decision still deserves time. She smiled with quiet approval. Then you are approaching this the right way. Permanent choices should never be made simply because temporary emotions are overwhelming. Before I left, she encouraged me to continue protecting my financial interests while allowing myself enough time to decide whether reconciliation was truly possible. I appreciated that advice because it reminded me that wisdom and caution could exist together. When I returned home that evening, Olivia was sitting on the back patio watching the sunset disappear beyond the trees lining our neighborhood. She looked over as I stepped outside, but did not ask where I had been. Instead, she simply moved over to make room beside her. We sat together without speaking while the evening breeze carried the scent of freshly cut grass across the yard. After several quiet minutes, she finally asked, "Did you meet with the attorney?" I answered honestly, "Yes." She nodded once. I expected that. There was no disappointment in her voice, only acceptance. "If you decide to move forward without me," she continued softly, "I will respect that decision because I created the circumstances that brought us here." I looked out across the backyard where we had planted 2 maple trees shortly after buying the house. They were small enough then that we could wrap both hands around their trunks. Now they stood tall enough to shade half the lawn. Time changes everything willing to grow. I have not decided anything yet, I finally said. What matters now is whether our actions over the next several months match the promises we have made during the past 2 days. Olivia quietly agreed. For the first time in a very long while, neither of us tried to predict the future. We simply accepted that rebuilding trust would never happen through dramatic speeches or emotional apologies. It would happen, if it happened at all, through hundreds of ordinary choices made honestly one day after another. And somehow that realization felt far more powerful than any ending I had imagined when this journey first began. The weeks that followed did not transform our lives overnight. If anything, they taught us how slowly trust returns once it has been broken. Every morning Olivia left her phone on the kitchen counter without me asking. Every evening we shared dinner without the television playing in the background. Instead of filling the silence with distractions, we learned to ask questions we had ignored for years. Some conversations lasted only a few minutes. Others continued late into the night. None of them were easy, but every one of them was honest. Looking back now, I realized we had spent too much of our marriage assuming love alone could solve problems that actually required communication. Love had never disappeared. Honest conversation had. About a month after everything changed, Olivia suggested that we begin meeting with a licensed marriage counselor. I agreed because I no longer wanted either of us relying only on our own perspective. During our first session, the counselor listened carefully before asking a simple question. What frightened each of you the most? I answered first. I was afraid the life we built together had been replaced by a story I never knew existed. Olivia looked down at her hands before speaking. I was afraid that admitting my mistakes would mean there was no path back, so I kept postponing the truth until it became even more painful. The counselor nodded thoughtfully before explaining that secrecy often grows because people fear consequences, but delaying honesty almost always makes those consequences greater. Those words stayed with both of us long after the session ended. During the following weeks, we completed every exercise the counselor recommended. We wrote letters describing what trust meant to each of us. We discussed expectations we had never clearly expressed. We rebuilt simple habits that had quietly disappeared over the years, including eating dinner together several nights each week and taking long evening walks without our phones. None of those routines erased the past, yet they slowly reminded us why we had chosen one another in the first place. One Saturday afternoon, we visited the small neighborhood park where we used to spend time during the first years of our marriage. Families were enjoying picnics, children laughed near the playground, and cyclists passed along the nearby trail beneath tall oak trees. Olivia stopped beside the wooden footbridge overlooking the pond and turned toward me. I spent months believing I had already lost everything, she said quietly. Then I realized I almost lost it because I stopped protecting what mattered most. I understood exactly what she meant. Betrayal had not begun with one decision. It had begun with countless smaller choices to avoid difficult conversations. As we stood there watching the sunlight reflect across the water, I realized something equally important. Preparing legal documents had given me security. Gathering evidence had given me clarity. But neither of those things alone could determine the future of our marriage. Only our actions after the truth had been revealed could do that. By the time we drove home that evening, I noticed something I had not felt in many months. I was no longer measuring every day against the pain of the past. Instead, I had begun quietly paying attention to the consistency of the present. Trust was not returning because of one emotional apology or one dramatic promise. It was returning through ordinary moments lived differently than before, and for the first time since Olivia packed her suitcase for that trip, I believed our future would ultimately be decided not by the mistakes that nearly ended our marriage, but by the honesty we finally chose to practice every single day. Nearly a year passed before I truly understood how much a single decision could change the direction of an entire life. Not the decision Olivia made before that trip, and not even the decision I made to prepare for the worst. The decision that mattered most was the one we continued making every ordinary day afterward. We chose honesty even when it was uncomfortable. We chose difficult conversations instead of comfortable silence. We chose to rebuild trust through actions rather than promises. Looking back now, I realized that healing never arrived in one dramatic moment. It arrived quietly, one morning at a time, as life slowly became recognizable again. We returned to simple traditions that had once defined our marriage. Saturday breakfasts at our favorite neighborhood cafe, evening walks after work, weekend visits with family. We laughed more naturally than we had in years, not because the past disappeared, but because we stopped allowing it to control every new memory we created. There were still moments when an unexpected business trip or a delayed flight reminded me of everything that had happened. Instead of becoming defensive, Olivia understood those moments before I said a word. She answered my questions with patience, shared information openly, and never asked me to ignore my feelings simply because time had passed. That consistency accomplished something apologies alone never could. It slowly restored the confidence that had once seemed impossible to recover. One autumn afternoon, we found ourselves sitting on the front porch watching the maple trees we planted years earlier lose their leaves. The same trees that had been small enough to fit inside our hands now stretched high above the roof of our home. Olivia smiled softly and said, "I used to believe love was enough to protect a marriage." I looked toward the yard before answering. "I think love is where a marriage begins. Trust is what allows it to keep growing." She reached for my hand, and for the first time since everything changed, that simple gesture felt completely natural again. Months later, I cleaned out the desk drawer where I had stored the folder containing every document I once believed would mark the end of our marriage. Flight confirmations, hotel reservations, financial records, notes written during long nights filled with uncertainty. I looked through them one final time before placing them into the shredder. Those papers had served their purpose. They protected me when I needed clarity, but they no longer represented the future I wanted to carry forward. As the last page disappeared, I realized something I will never forget. Being one step ahead was never about preparing better than someone else. It was about refusing to let fear make my decisions for me. Preparing gave me peace. Truth gave me direction. Forgiveness, offered carefully and earned patiently, gave both of us another chance to build something stronger than the life we almost lost. If there is one lesson I carried away from every difficult conversation, every sleepless night, and every uncertain day, it is this. A lasting marriage is not defined by the absence of mistakes. It is defined by two people who eventually find the courage to stop hiding from the truth, accept responsibility for their choices, and keep choosing one another with honesty every single day.